are, what makes us the person we are, and why do we have cognitive biases, and can they make us vulnerable in one sense, the way we process and interpret a certain event. So for example, we've just been talking about presentations or an interview. You could magnify and exaggerate the danger. You hypothesize a negative scenario which has a correlation with anxiety or feeling anxious. So we talked about public speaking, how that can exacerbate and correlate to feeling anxious. You hypothesize what could happen, what could go wrong, or you might have an underlying schema from years gone by. You were told off at school for not doing your homework, get to the front of the room, and thereafter you have a series of feelings. You feel a certain way when you stand up in front of people. Your heart starts beating, you feel nervous, and so on and so forth. So very briefly, we talked about the fine line between clinical and performance. And it is a fine line in the sense that I was at a conference recently to do with mental health in football, and one thing that became apparent to me is there is a fine line between what's clinical, what's performance. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, the sports person has an issue, whatever that issue might be. It could be gambling, could be depression, could be anxiety. At what point do you draw the line and say, okay, I think you should go see or seek treatment, or I'll deal with that? And I say it's a fine line because your job in sport, for example, as a coach, or as a sports psychologist or mental skills coach, is to get the best out of the performer. But equally, if they present you with a problem, well, they might say, well, I'm breaking up with my wife or my husband, or I'm going through bereavement. Now, that's going to affect their game, possibly, and you can help them to a point, possibly, but that adverse event could also spark depression, for example. And at what point do you sort of say, well, actually, I think you're probably best seeing a GP or a clinician? And there's a fine line there for me, because depending what your remit is, there is a lot of grey areas. It's never really one thing or the other, easy to identify, because we're going to go through life, no matter who we are, we're not immune to adversity. That's just the way life is. It's tough. So, you know, it's find that balance, and I've talked about safeguarding before, and I'll talk about it again. I don't offer safeguarding course, although I do cover it on the hypnosis course that we do run. And the reason being is that it's just good to know. It's good to be aware of vulnerabilities and people to get the best help. Because you get someone could email you, for example. I got an email the other day saying, well, you do hypnosis. And so I emailed back, how can I be of assistance? Well, I've got trauma I want to explore. Can you take me to the subconscious? I said, well, that being a metaphor, it's not a structural part of the brain, the subconscious. It's metaphorical, and if you're Freudian, it's the dustbin of all things, you know, bad. And if you're hypnosis, it's benevolent, a place you can go to solve. But the reality is that maybe we're referring more to the components of the brain that are automatic. So you breathe. You know, we talked about in the first module the structures of the brain, the evolution of the brain. So it could be the limbic structures, it could be the primal structures. You breathe without telling yourself to breathe. You feel emotions. Hypothalamus, you know when you want to drink, or thirsty, or hungry, or you regulate. Homeostasis. So these things happen automatically. You cut yourself, you heal. So the point being is that there is a fine line. And I said to the person emailing me, have you had treatment before? They said, well, I had a while ago, and it was through the health service, so they said, but it wasn't, or it didn't take me to where I needed to go. I need someone to help me access the deep subconscious part of the brain. And I said, well, you know, I'd need to at least speak to the, or they can communicate with if they want to, the clinician you've been seeing to see if it's appropriate. Well, why would you do that? Because you know if you're going to regress someone, it's pretty deep stuff. You can open Pandora's box. But I don't know anything about the person. So they could have psychosis, they could have, and that's not going to probably be advisable to do hypnosis if they have that. I mean, possibility that it could be done depending on what they want it for, but generally speaking, the fragility of the mind may not be the right thing to do. But the point being is that so you've got the screening, you sort of can email something out to pick up red flags, and there is a fine line, isn't there? Because you go to work and someone I was working with years ago, it was a business not too far away from here, he'd lost his daughter only a few months earlier, and you know, they brought coaches in to see him and it wasn't working out. I worked with him for 2 or 3 sessions. I went to the managing director, I said, you know what, I think if you want my opinion, it's just my opinion, he needs clinical help. Now I'm not here to do that, that's not my remit. I'm here to do some coaching you've asked me to do, but I'm going to step down because I don't think it's advisable for him at this moment in time. We're giving him 2 months off. I said, I don't think, in my opinion, and I can see why. So, you know, there is that to sort of take in consideration. The adverse event, I felt, in my opinion, it was still trauma. The last thing on his mind was anything to do with the business that he was doing before. He still needed time to recuperate, and how much time do you put in these things? Well, one only knows. But what we do know is that adverse events can correlate with different affective disorders going forward. So to give an example of this, by the way, and I always say to people, use the skills based on your remit. You know, if you're a teacher, use the skills to work on an area. You pick up a red flag that the student has some sort of depressive disorder, affective disorder, then probably want to refer them otherwise. If someone's got anxiety, for example, you may want them to go see a medical person before you work with them because they could identify biomarkers. It could be a number of organic disorders, anxiety. So it could be, I don't know, not that I'm a medical person, but we do know anxiety correlates with organic disorders such as tumours, degenerative brain conditions such as higher cortisol levels in the bloodstream, all these things really. So you'd probably want to eliminate as much as one can do. And you know, the email I got back from the person who inquired that didn't buy into that system. I said, well, you know, I'm just following some protocol. So I mention that because it's always useful to be aware of that, I think, because it's easy for the coach to stand over the client, sort of gauge, and I will touch on it in more detail on the course as much as one can do on a course. But it's a worrying thing these days. A little information becomes a lot. And we see with the explosion on the internet, it's a great place, the internet, you can learn a lot of things, and so much sharing going on, but there is also a danger. You know, it's a danger in the sense that I showed you those questions I would use at the start of the course, and I'll run through them again. You might want to use those to make a judgment in terms of what protocol you sort of adhere to, because that will give you an idea. I'm not saying it's got to be science-based to be useful, but I'm saying that there's got to sort of have an idea of where the person's coming from. We do live in a generation now where people are, you know, they'll jump on a 2-day course and think they can, you know, cure the world's problems, and they might be able to, but the point being is it can be pretty worrying in that sense. But that's another story for another day, and certainly that's where sort of safeguarding comes in, because these things are complex, multifactorial, and they have a psychosocial base, but they've also got a genetic base as well. So, you know, so sort of linking this anyway. So we would talk about attentional biases and anxiety and depressive disorders. So we see the research suggests that patients with depression correlated with the ability to recall a bad memory. So the more severe depression, according to Lloyd and Lishman, the easier the patient found to recall a bad memory. So it's autographical attention bias. So attentional is more, the attention bias is more linked to anxiety and memory to depression, according to the literature. So depression has the characteristic of recalling a negative event in the past. Okay, so attentional is more linked to anxiety, memory more to depression. So biographical memory, in a long story short, is a crucial component of human functionality to reflect and recall past experience and events, because that has an impact on your identity. Okay, so I mentioned before aversion. If I was in danger once, then I want to know if the situation I'm going to put myself in could cause danger. So our biographical memory is key. It's a crucial component to function. How we know who we are, the definition of oneself, our identity. Okay, so research by Teasdale suggested that people with depression might have more severe experiences to draw from. So the balance between ambiguous and neutral memory could be tilted on the spectrum. So something that you might find not as severe, someone with depression could find a lot more severe than what you do, if that makes sense. So even something that's ambiguous. So ambiguous could be they might be given some news. So they might have gone to a doctor, for example, for an appointment, and the protocol is to call you to tell you the results. So, okay, that's ambiguous. You don't know what the results are, but you missed the call, you get the voicemail, and the ambiguity, you tilt it towards the worst case scenario in one respect. What's a neutral memory? Something that's happened in the past, you went away, didn't think anything of it, anyone else didn't think nothing of it, but to the person with depression it might have been a lot more severe. You could have been sat at a table on holiday and talked about something, and the person sort of magnified more than other people. So Disney Beavers, Hay and Beck suggested hyperarousal in the amygdala. It commences. So here we start to see a neurobiological link to cognitive bias and bias persistence, which can influence people with depression. We shift the client's attention in memory, so we can start to look at reappraising. So as we sort of go along today, this links in, we sort of start to see, okay, that there is a neurobiological link in appraisal. How we perceive the situation can have a big impact. Now, I'm not suggesting, for those of you who don't work in therapy, and it's not your remit to go around doing this in this area, but what I am suggesting is the possibility to transfer some of the concepts of the model that we're going to cover in other areas too, to reappraise, which we'll go into more detail. So, you know, according to literature, the difference in biases amongst depression and anxiety, we mentioned that predominantly focus on past selective negative bias, and anxiety is focused on attention. So the attention anxiety person is going to, for example, their hypothesis, like I mentioned earlier, an interview, it could start with, I'm going to mess things up, I'm feeling anxious, if I don't get the job, I'm going to struggle to pay the bills, I'm going to end up living on the street, I'll be homeless, or they could imagine themselves being in a presentation, everyone's going to laugh at me. So they do the presentation, and maybe someone in the back might have smiled at something that had nothing to do with them, and that sort of is the focus of attention. Does that make sense? And that sort of caused. But that's sort of, in a nutshell, and we sort of talk about memories. One of the things about memories is they fade. They gradually fade. Why do they fade? We'll talk about that, because they're not as rich, because we've only got finite neurons, which over time get used for new memories. So there's a case for reappraising situations and running over them and creating new experiences for people that we talk about in the course quite frequently. So you could have gone away on holiday last year, and the day after it's a lot more rich in memory than what it is now, albeit the emotional link, and we talked about in the first module, could be equally, if not more intense, depending on what the experience was. Okay, so if you sort of broke up on holiday and you're in love with that person and you're upset about breaking up, the feeling could still be as it was in that respect. But the actual sensory perception of the experience is going to not be as it was, one would think, because the way we sort of process information, and we get ourselves in these limiting states. So a state can be generalized as we could feel victimized, or we could be empowered. Hence, I think one of the most useful things we can do existentially is find meaning in adversity, in whichever way we can. That's a useful thing. But generally speaking, the person who's got more flexibility in states will always dominate a situation because they've got the capability to make that transition. Okay, and you know, those who've got children or been around children, you sort of get dragged into an argument, and you know that at some point you've got to access your resources, the state that you're in. You've got to sort of somehow, if we want to talk about transactional analysis, we talk about the parent, the professional, the child state. So that's very influential, isn't it? In the sense that, okay, what am I adopting? Am I getting drawn in? So we know that there are certain states that are disempowering and some that are useful. The more you can access various states, the better it is. And you know when the parent argues that the teenager gets drawn into being a teenager themselves, without realizing the teenager, the brain maturation is not developed yet. So due to brain maturation not being developed yet, they're going to struggle to process information like the parent would, because after 24 or so, the brain gets developed, which is key. And that's the sort of thing to think about, and sort of do realise that after sort of piece that there is a point where people struggle to process this information. I've pieced briefly before we sort of go here, I may have mentioned on the first block of the course, just in passing, that I was at a train station one time, and there were a group of teenagers smoking what I think was cannabis, but because the smell was really bad, I thought it might have been skunk, and hence the name, because the bad smell it is. And me being the way I am, I sort of, I didn't know what to do. I just, for some reason, said something, but it was out of concern. I thought, wow, this is a worrying thing here. Not only obviously what they're doing, but the worrying thing is at that age, with the brain maturation being the way it is, you've got to think, well, there must be a higher prevalence in sparking a psychotic. But then when you've got people putting silly stuff on the internet about cannabis who don't know a great deal, and it could be useful for some people but not useful for others, you kind of think, well, it's not really setting a good example, because obviously, you know, there is a component in some of that stuff, and from a genetic point of view, one person might get away with it for 20 years, but one person might take one puff and, you know, and we know that obviously it's a lot more synthetic now. But anyway, a long story short, is it goes back to the brain maturation. So my own sort of it's not a proven theory, it's just my own thought. Reading literature, one of the reasons I think that there seems to be a higher prevalence in psychotic with young people about who do take or smoke cannabis, I think because their brain maturation. Now, I could be wrong. It's not a proven theory, but I think that makes some sort of sense. So, you know, going back to the drawing board here again, states are key. So we can be more empowered in our state. Emotions, by the way, can be stored alongside our memory for details of an event. Okay? So, an event, I talked about aversion. We can avoid a situation. But also, as well as that aversion, we can avoid a dangerous situation, which could be perceived as a presentation, could be an interview, but it could be walking down a dark alley. But in a particular mood or experience an emotion, at a later time, we can make the transition a lot easier. You can retrieve it a lot better. So all things being well, functioning well, mentally you sort of know. So you went to Toastmasters the first time, you had an experience, and that emotion's there, it's in there, the mood. You go again, you've got an idea, but also serves as a motivation too. The reward system of the brain, you think, well, actually, no, I'm going to plan it. That's with an experience, all things being well. So by improving access to certain memories, we're able to better select appropriate behavior responses. So there's a link between emotion and behavior. Okay, we've just been doing some work this morning on appropriate behavior responses. hence the work you've been doing, hence the linkage in the course. So you sort of think, how did I respond last time? And did anyone have it in the course where you felt, you know what, I responded this way last time and I felt like this? I felt bad, I felt happy, I felt neutral. So the work you did this morning, you're able to put that on paper, consciously be aware. Okay, what I did last time, how I felt about it. And how you felt about it can affect the response you choose in the future. Do I do the same thing again? Now, that's not to say the behaviour itself is a positive one, because I mentioned in the first block where, okay, someone could, for example, harm themselves because they get attention from doing that, and they feel loved and significant. Okay, someone could beat someone up, and through doing that, they feel significant. Okay, and then they do it again. So it's not a good idea to go out beating people up. But the point being is that someone could do something positive, in the sense that, okay, they might go away and help someone carry the shopping bag, and that might be through love, that might be through significance. It's irrespective of that, but whichever reason they do it, you could make the point that the behaviour is a positive thing in certain situations. So that gives you an idea how memories correlate to the selection of a behavioural response. So you remember what happened last time? It's stored emotionally, and then you make a choice from a future response point of view. So, okay, what's a schema? So a schema is an organised abstract representation of knowledge about a particular situation or thing. So most schemas are like they're built up of our lives. Combination of our own direct experiences correlating with indirect knowledge through various sources. So for example, okay, if you haven't been to New York before, there's a good chance you've got an idea what it's like from what you've seen on TV. Okay, so we can all have an idea. I've not been there before, but I've got an idea from what I've seen on TV. So it's a bit of a combination about direct experiences and indirect knowledge. Okay, so I can imagine through radio, through other sources of information. So an example could be if someone invited you to their dining room, to their kitchen, would you have an idea what to expect in that room? I mean, what would you expect in the kitchen? Anything? Sorry? A cooker, yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Any smells? Any sort of, yeah. Yeah.
Baking bread. Smells, you might notice the flooring.
Yeah.
Sort of a typical, might be a small kitchen, might be a large kitchen. There might be a table there, there might not be.
Yeah.
You sort of form an opinion or a picture.
Yeah, and that's based. But then if you invited someone over from a part of the world who's never been in the kitchen and dining room before, let's say someone in I don't know, some tribe somewhere in the Amazon, for example, and equally if they invite us to their domain, we wouldn't know. But they wouldn't know, the experience isn't there, directly, indirectly. So we build up these perceptions in time. Now, schema's not a new thing. It's been around for a while. Kant wrote about it in his writing 18th, 19th century, so it's a similar concept. In the 20th century, you've probably heard of the Swiss psychologist Jim Piaget, infant and child development. For those of you who've heard of Piaget, and it came to prominence again. But if you get a chance to, it's useful reading. It became mainstream in '67, the publication of a seminal book called Cognitive Psychology, written by Ulrich Nieser. The book, you could argue, marked the true birth of the discipline, and it's probably still worth a read. You sort of start to get an idea of the schema. But which schema is activated will depend on the nature of the trigger. The trigger would be sight, hear, feel, the implicit. So cutting it, making it in a simplistic way, a very simplistic way of putting it, so fire hot. So if you put your hand in fire, you think you put it back in there again? Well, probably not. Probably not, unless you do the fire walk at the Tony Robbins event. Then But the point being is that you may do it again because you get a buzz out of it. So under normal circumstances, don't try this at home. But if you go to Tony Robbins, you get to walk on fire. And I think they should sort of do a seminar where you walk on water. That would be pretty amazing. I'd be really impressed then. Yeah. Never mind fire, walk on water. I mean, you're doing something, right?
You can do that in Tibet.
Exactly, yeah. My understanding is, yeah, definitely. So, in the Cvt model, so we sort of see the schema here, these early experiences that influence our world, our reality. So it's almost like a trigger. And we'll sort of talk about that very briefly shortly. But you can sort of see in the model where you've got your thoughts, you have a schema, a trigger, and that has an impact. How you perceive an event, your perception of a certain situation, these early experiences you've had in life have an impact on us throughout our life, which we'll sort of touch on. So I've used this example before. It's an easy way of putting it, a simplistic way of putting it. So we all decide to go for a walk to the shop at lunchtime, and one of us had a dog similar to this as a 5-year-old and was really loving and best friend and so on and so forth. One of us was attacked by a dog like that as a 5-year-old and it bit half the leg off. One of us had no experience of it. And we all go for this walk at lunchtime. If we see a similar type of dog many years later, what's the reaction going to be? The person who had a loving experience, what do you think they're going to do? Yeah, precisely. That's their experience. What do the person who's their leg got bitten off by a dog? Yeah. And the neutral person's like, well, what's all the fuss about? So you can see this. You can see they can all have a disagreement. Is the dog dangerous? Is it not dangerous? Well, that depends on your experience. It may be dangerous for all I know, but the point being is that it comes back to your experience. It's going to influence your perception of that reality. So you could easily dispute it's dangerous, and what's all the fuss about, but you can see how an experience can influence us in variable ways, experiences. And this is a simplistic way of putting it, by the way, but it gives you an idea, an illustration going forward. So what Beck did say, according to Beck 91, one of his papers, was how an individual interprets life plays a role in determining how he or she responds to those events. So, you're walking through, so one of you might run back to safety. One of you might go over and stroke the dog. One of you might just think, well, let's carry on. What's the big deal? So certain events in your life play a role in determining how you're going to respond to a certain situation. So your belief, the way you process information. So in the Cvt world, sort of going off piece a little bit, the Cvt people, they teach their clients or patients, whatever you want to call them, however you want to frame it, to identify the maladaptive beliefs and processing tendencies, to systematically test the accuracy of those beliefs and tendencies. So so rather than arguing, saying, you're a coward and it's only a small dog, or rather than saying, no, you're mad, I'm not going to run across. So there's a systematic way of challenging that in adverse to doing it that way. And that's the way they do things in their world, which can be quite useful. It can be quite useful. The science backs it up too. But anyway, so you encourage the person the accuracy of the belief. So you can engage on various experiments where the behaviours are systematically varied in order to test the accuracy of the belief. So for example, the example is we've used before. So you go into town centre at lunchtime, you see someone you know well, and they walk straight past you. You believe might be they fall out of me, they ignored me, or someone doesn't text back. The ignorant side not text back or whatever. So it can be, and then not text back because they don't like me, or so on and so forth. The belief. And then you go back to speak to someone and say, well, do you not think they might have been preoccupied or busy. And that sort of changes the whole dynamic of the situation, how you feel. Because the way you felt when the person ignored you, at least you thought they did, was down, angry, frustrated. But the way you feel now is actually they could have been preoccupied, so you feel more neutral. You didn't get a text back, you might think, okay, I'm not personalising it. And they may have been ignoring it, that goes without saying, but the point being is that without sort of examining things, and you can jump into conclusions. So the emphasis is to identify faults. Okay? So back 6-7, the model posits the appraisal of a specific situation, the interpretation of the situation, the cascading cycle interconnected and meshed through the appraisal situation, looking at the emotions, feelings, behaviour, physiology. So you've got this sort of mesh all rolled into one. What's what? So the models suggest, look at the interpretation of the event is underpinned by automatic beliefs. So it cascades a set of consequences. So you think your friend ignored you, and all of a sudden you feel angry, and then you behave erratically. You send them a text saying you're ignorant so-and-so. Physiologically you feel mad, rage. So they're a trigger from a spectrum of automatic thoughts to deeper beliefs. These deep beliefs going forward. So, you know, originally in 67, Beck says the correlation between the deviation of thinking patterns between patients who have depression and those who don't, proposing that the source of maladaptive was a distorted version of reality, the force that cascaded into a cycle interconnected and meshed through the appraisal of the situation. Now, I would suggest a little bit more complex than that when it comes to depression. That's, you could say from a psychosocial point of view, there is some mileage there. The research does suggest that, but it's probably not as simple as that. Is it the chicken or the egg? Does the person have the depression, or the person doesn't have that mood? Does one spark on the other? So that would be an interesting way to look at things. But the point being is that, so for example, to overcome a phobia, maladaptive behaviour, we need to cognitively restructure our perception. Hence, when I talked about phobias in the first module, I sort of brought some of this stuff in, saying it's useful stuff, how you appraise it. Now, how you appraise the situation is really important. When faced with a spider, depending on which part of the world you live in. If you see a spider in this country, you probably won't be as petrified as if you saw one in a country where they run across the room and bite it. Well, at least you think they're going to do that. So experiences. But you know, where I grew up, they used to tell them to check your shoes, and make sure you check the toilet, make sure you check your bed linen for spiders. You don't want to get bitten by a funnel web. You're in trouble. But you don't get the same information here young, and you're going to react differently if you see one. But now that I've corrected my thinking, I'm okay. I can live with spiders. It's sharks I can't live with. but by the way, some things that are innate to research suggests, like snakes. Speaking of phobias, there's some evidence now suggests that snake phobia is innate. So that's really fascinating. And to think about it, when you think about it, how's a dog and a cat, or a rat know to run from a cat? So it's quite fascinating. So that's going to open things up. I mean, technology now is going to really blow the door open. But going back to cognitive model, in the third wave, the cognitive health therapy, you see a change. You see a bit of a change in the cognitive models, which we won't go into on this course, but I'll send you some stuff, which is quite interesting. But if long and short, really is the cognitive model was almost like a progression on the general behaviorism, and the cognitive model will see behaviorism as a reduction of linear pattern, just too simplistic. The cause effect that we talked about, the behaviorism, the beginning, the little Albert experiment where they sort of ring the loud noise and so on and so forth. And so we know that, okay, that might be simplistic in one sense, but equally in saying that, there's many methods in the world of CBT that they use to untangle these faults, by the way, after they've identified the distortion. See, because it's been popularized now, distortion, so they sort of narrowed it down to 10 or 11, whereas years gone by there's a lot more. But the things that they use: examine the evidence, double standard method, experimental technique, thinking of shades of grey, survey method, define terms, semantic method, retribution, cost-benefit analysis, And a couple of things I've brought into the course actually, like the analysis, and a couple of things I've brought in that are quite useful, I think anyway. But the distortion was thought of as a concept by Beck, who's probably considered as being one of the forefathers of CBT, but was popularised by David Burns. David Burns, in his, I think it was called the Feel Good Handbook, he labelled 10 or 11 distortions, top of my head. And these were the ones that we have. Okay, all or nothing, overgeneralisation, mental filter, discount the positive, inclusion, magnification, emotional reasoning, should statements, labelling, and blame. So just to go as far as label it for the person you're working with, but it can be useful to know. Okay, so we won't have time because lunch is drawn upon us, but I can send you some stuff that gives you a lot more details on the actual.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, is that in our book?
No, it's in a separate PDF I sent across. Yeah, if you've got the PDF, just drop me an email, and we'll go into detail. But to give you an example, so okay, let's say for example, you're doing a presentation. We'll stick with presentations. We've talked about that this morning. You go for a presentation, and okay, you're a bit apprehensive about doing it because you feel they won't like you. So they've not met them before, but you emotional reading. Well, how do you know? Well, I feel they won't like me. And then all of a sudden you say, well, actually, as it happens, the last time I went there, one person said one thing, negative when I spoke. And you magnify it because 20 people said you were good. But then you jump on the conclusion, no, I know they're not going to. This is a simplistic way because of time. I know they're going to give you bad feedback. Well, you don't know because you haven't had feedback from them before. And you may have had, but then you discount the positives. Then you do get feedback, when they give you those little feedback strips, and 9 of them are great, 1 of them's a bit ambiguous, and you think, well, see, I told you so. And discount the positive. And then you sort of focus on that one negative one, the mental filter, and you overgeneralise. I can never do this again. I'm rubbish. I know they're speaker. I may as well give up. All or nothing. I may as well give up. I should stick to something else. Label. I'm hopeless. Not good enough. And blame. It's because my teachers, my parents, the people just. So you get the gist of it, don't you? So you can sort of label if you want to. But a useful model to use is the ABC model, by the way. So situation, thoughts. So you can see the situation. It's not the situation. It's your appraisal of the situation. Your perception. Okay, and obviously the underlying belief that is deeper than that. So I mentioned earlier the situation could be, let's think of a situation, presenting. What might someone's thoughts be about presenting? Anything, if they do a presentation, what might their thoughts be?
They might think they're not good enough.
Yeah, okay, anything else?
That somebody's going to laugh at them.
Okay, and where did that thought come from, do you think?
Could be past experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Could be an underlying schema. And how are they going to feel not good enough?
Possibly nervous.
Yeah, exactly. And how do you think they might behave?
Fidgety.
Yeah, they might even take off out of the room.
Yeah, they might shut down.
Yeah, absolutely. What about, how do you think they might feel physically?
Fight or flight, just they might
Precisely.
sweat.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you can sort of see it's quite a useful model in that sense. In the sense that we can sort of appraise situations. I've transferred the components of the model in sport. So a game, situation, a sporting event, the situation. What are your thoughts about the situation? Quite useful to use. You can see it can be quite a useful thing even there. So I feel concerned. I don't think we're good enough to beat the opposition. I think that they have an advantage over us. All these sort of things can come out. Now, it may be real, it may not be, because you've got fact, opinion. Okay, fact, opinion, you could say, okay, is it a long way from here to the door? Well, you could say it's an opinion, because you had a condition medically, it might be a long way. Is it 5 metres? Well, that's probably factual if you've got a tape measure up, but you can see here, everyone responds differently. The appraisal is key. So the boss, there might be redundancies at your work on Monday, and all things being equal, the boss walks straight past you. Okay, what do you think your thoughts are going to be? the boss normally says hello, the manager, but they walk straight past you. How are you going to react? What are your thoughts going to be? Well, my numbers are. It could be me, okay, and so on and so forth. I could be being made redundant. Then you start feeling really sad, and then you go find someone to reinforce it as well. That's sort of going away from here, but as a reinforcer, the confirmation bias type thing, and that's these underlying beliefs. And then you start behaving erratically. You send the boss 100 emails. You know, done that before. You're scathing, you know, how dare you, you know, and physically. And then you decide, actually, you know what, you didn't send the emails, you sort of went on draft. You go speak to Fred, the resident pastoral role, and he says, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And you start to restructure your thought process and think, well, actually, you know what, the boss may have been preoccupied. They might be nervous. They might be making me redundant. And the whole perception changes. Okay? Feelings change, you feel more neutral. So you might not go from, okay, from really, really sad to go to ecstatic, but you might be more neutral. And in that neutral state, you're in a better place to make it an action. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah, and you can sort of see it's quite useful, I think. For me, it's useful because I think the triangle, in its simplistic form, illustrates the problem of functioning as well as solutions. I think also it provides an inroad for choosing intervention for a particular problem. Because what I do is, you know, sort of, doesn't run synchronize the model, kind of bounces back and forth. So you can sort of strike at different areas. So, okay, I might do a breathing strategy. Just breathe through my tummy, calm the parasympathetic down. I might behavioural strategy, okay, imagery, visualization, feeling, strategy for emotion, talk about it, various strategies you can use for that, challenge the thought as well, maybe trace the schema. So, you know, you can start thinking now beyond the course what interventions you can do to strike at various areas. It's quite useful. And that's not suggesting if you're not in therapy, because not all of you are in therapy, some of you in other areas, you can still use the blueprint, I think. Still a useful blueprint to use in the sense that, okay, well, we went back to what we said earlier, knowing the remit. Well, actually, you know what, that might be for someone else to do. Well, how do you feel about the situation? And the person says to you, I feel really low and down. I just can't break out of it. And then you sort of dig a bit deeper and you think, well, actually, you know what, this might be for someone else to help, another professional. It might be that you do say, well, maybe you want to see a GP or a clinician to help with that. Or maybe that you do that and they come back to you to sort of deal with whatever you need to do the best way you can without putting the person first. So it can be useful for that too. But equally, it could just be that the person has a performance anxiety as well about presenting or interviews for you coaches. And think, okay, the interview, what are your thoughts? And perhaps there's things you can do to help the person. So the person needs to do an interview. It could be, okay, I'm nervous. The last 10 interviews haven't gone well. Or the last time I didn't go well. If I don't get the job, this is going to happen. I feel nervous. It's compounding behaviorally. I'm not a lot more erratic. I'm a lot, and physically they get really nervous at the thought of it. Things you can give the person to work with. Image visualization, anchoring, many techniques you've got that you could use if they're appropriate in that situation. But I said earlier, it's about, as a coach, it's about sort of being aware as to what is what. So we're going to do a process shortly that's going to give you a better idea before we break. So we can sort of break problems down. Okay. So in the world of CBT, it's not the event as such. It's the meaning, the individual attributes of the event and their thoughts about it. Then will have an impact on the emotions. Okay. The cognitive model says that there is an active event, then there's a belief that's associated to negative thoughts or cognitive biases. Okay? And it says that psychological difficulties are the result of cognitive distortions and biases. The deeper the level, the more we move from the negative automatic thought to the intermediate belief, to the core belief. The more deeply rooted the cognition and the more entrenched the psychological distress is. So they say. So the first wave of CBT held assumptions that certain cognitions, emotions, and physiological state can lead to mental distress, and the therapeutic interventions should aim at removing them or reducing them or altering them. The third wave became a bit more content-orientated and emphasised different forms of behaviourism. According to CBT therapists, this is all linked together so that one aspect of this cycle has an impact on the other aspect of the cycle. They're all interconnected in what's called a vicious cycle, so to speak. What we're going to do is a technique which we'll come back to after lunch. By the way, we'll come back to after lunch, and I did email you the Word document. If you haven't got that, doesn't matter. We can still do this after lunch anyway if you've not brought it in. But I can email it to you again if we can get back online. But the point being, what we can do here is a process. And I'll run through it in the last 5 minutes we've got before lunch, which will be very brief, and we can practice in pairs. So, okay, let's take the components of this model and the practicality of it. So take a situation that was slightly, I wouldn't say distressing. It may have been going to Toastmasters the first time. It may have been going for an interview. It could have been generally a confrontation out at work. Okay, maybe a slight confrontation at work that you had. And just get an overview. What happened? Where, with whom, how, just the gist of what went on. Then rate the emotion from 0 to 100%, with 100% being high. So it could have been an alteration at work, a bit of an argument, and you felt 80%. Or you Toastmasters first time, you felt 80%. Okay, what emotion you felt at the time? Anger, frustration, fear. Okay. Any physical sensations? And if so, where were they? See the illustration there, we're using we're separating the mesh. It's a great way for you, if it's applicable and appropriate to what you do, it's a great little template to use to separate the mesh going forward. Because then you've got your own interventions you can use as part of your remit to help the person go forward, or refer them if it's not your call. So where it was physically, what they noticed, whereabouts in the body. Then the next part of the process is what unhelpful thoughts, images went through my mind. So you can imagine if you're doing, say, Toastmasters first time, you probably saw people all formal, or it might have been all these great speakers, and where will I fit in there? And the alteration at work could have been a person, breathing fire, or so on and so forth. And just think, what disturbed me? Okay, what did those thoughts, images, memories mean to me, or say about me in that situation? What am I responding to? What button is it pressing for me? What's the worst thing that can happen? The best? The most realistic? So is it worst scenario? Best scenario? The most realistic scenario? So Toastmasters, sit down and just sit down and take it in your own stride. It could be the alteration at work, and the most realistic thing is things will smooth over, and so generally speaking, sort of get an idea. And then really is where we sort of start to the flip side to it, is to have a more balanced, realistic view. So you stop and take a breath and ask yourself, is it fact, opinion, whatever is going through your mind. You might be thinking, I'll never speak to this person again. You might be thinking, well, I'm going to mess things up as a speaker and I'll never go back again. You might think, well, whatever scenario it is it fact or opinion? And what would someone else say about the situation? What's the bigger picture? If you're advising someone else who had your problem, what would you tell them? If someone told you they were nervous about going to Toastmasters, about an interview, and they were sad about alteration at work, argument at work, what advice would you give them? Okay, externalize it. Okay, is your reaction in proportion to the event? So you get to Toastmasters and you run out the door. you have an alteration at work, you send the person 100 emails, scathing emails, you know, whatever it is in proportion to the situation. And that's a really important one. Sometimes you never get into situations where you think that the action isn't in proportion to the situation. It just escalates beyond anyone's imagination. It starts with something small, well, not small, it's important to the people, but it ends up being a big thing, a lot bigger than it needs to be. So this can be useful also in conflict resolution, by the way. In one sense, people just start to see, well, actually, you know what, is what you're doing to each other, you know, which is key. But we know emotions are funny things in that respect, because emotions are there to keep you alive, survive as a species. And you might not process it primarily. We go into the primal brain, might think, well, they're taking something away from me. If I lose my job, if I speak and mess up, in worst scenario, the emotions can't differentiate being chased from a lion to just, well, I'll probably get another job again, so to speak. Okay, what did I do? What could I do different? What's the best response going forward? So next time, I might bring a friend to Toastmasters, or next time I might decide to join in and do a table topic. Next time I might just sit down and watch other people. What would I do differently? The alteration could be, next time I'll be more calm about things. So I don't know, it's just sort of giving you an idea what to, then you rewrite the emotion that you had originally. And the idea is for the emotion to reduce itself.
Could you use some modalities as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Change the perspective.
Absolutely, I would. Absolutely, I think so. Drawing the colours, turn the sounds down. Absolutely, and you know, whatever you think or see fit, depending on situation. Obviously, if it's your remit, if it's appropriate, I don't see any reason why not. In the context of what we've spoken about briefly here, but it's a useful technique to use, and I think it's really useful. And then you can examine the consequences of what you'll do differently, what's more effective, because you know the more choices you've got behaviourally, the better place you'll be. The law reacts at variety. The more choice you've got, the better it is. So you've got choice. Expand your awareness and see what happens. And go from there. And that's a process. But we'll have a go at practicing the process after lunchtime, so you get a really good feel for it and get an idea. And I would certainly suggest, in my infinite wisdom, if you have a client, to maybe go away and do it on their own too. Because, you know, they go away and it's important they do some work as well and come back and maybe do it again. And you know, it could take 10 minutes, could take an hour, could take 5 minutes to get it done. Just to get an idea. Okay, it could be, you know, you got a party to go to at the weekend, you feel a bit nervous. And maybe have a go at that. Okay, it might not be a big deal for you to go to a party because you might like parties. But then the person you're going to a party with, their ex-husband could be going to a party. Our situation once, this woman I was working with, and she was struggling to go to her daughter's wedding. And the reason being is that her ex-husband was going to be there and he'd found a new wife. It's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because she sort of was dismayed at what had happened. So you can fully appreciate, you know. And whilst I didn't use this model on its own, because she wanted to go, it was a good starting point to get an idea of what she could do. Some strategies in place so she can go and enjoy it best she can, because she wanted to be there. So, okay, it gives you a bit of an idea. We can sort of water the emotion down. Something like the situation, but quite useful in that situation. So I've used it, you know, many times before. You can work with me, you'll know. I'll send it out for things, interview, any situation you're going to appraise, sporting event, loads of things. Because you know, where you are here is going to have a big impact on what you do behaviourally and how you feel about the situation. If you're in a good place, or as good as a place you can be, you're going to react different if otherwise. If you're calm, going into a speaking group or going into an interview or going into a conversation, a dialogue with someone, you've got a better chance than what you would do otherwise, one would think. where you can sort of regulate your emotion better, which is key. So on that note, we'll break for lunch. After lunch, we'll get some time to do some practical stuff. We've got a lot of an exciting, action-packed afternoon, a lot of interactivity, and we'll go from there.